Okay. My name's Helen Dixon. I was involved in Nicaragua, where I lived for about 23 years, in a television program called Contracorriente, but I was also involved in a previous one to that called Sexto Sentido, and it was by the same institution, which is called Puntos de Encuentro.
Right. What was the main goal of Contracorriente project?
Well, it sort of has a social goal because Puntos de Encuentro, the original name for it is encounter points for the transformation of everyday life. So the sort of goal, I suppose, behind it was to contribute to the transformation of values around a series of key issues that we identified. So, and also to, I suppose, to a certain extent, to offer possible alternative pathways in terms of that. So there were these stories of people's lives and very, very concrete, real problems that are going on still in Nicaragua. And then telling that story in a way that showed the kind of alternative outcomes that you could develop if you're more conscious about what's going on and start to look at how the power issues are working. So, I mean, that's a kind of very long version of a name, but that's really what the gist of it was behind it. I can't remember what the actual planned aim was. Unfortunately, that means the stories took over.
All right. And can you just describe or tell what the project was about? Like what it was? A soap opera? Was it a website or what?
Yeah. So I think the key central story was the story of a girl and her mother who had sort of been living displaced in Costa Rica and then returned to Nicaragua to the heart of this family. And the sort of central story was how the girl ended up getting pulled into sexual exploitation and then eventually trafficking for sexual purposes. And how that occurred and what that had to do with the fact that her mother had been sexually abused in this family. So that's the kind of central story of it. But then around that there was, we worked on gay and trans politics, which was quite interesting, and sort of queered up the sort of concept of gayness too, which was really nice. And also sort of gender binaries around that one, which was great because some of the writers even had difficulties with that. I remember when we were discussing queer politics, we were saying, what do you mean queer? You know, what does this mean? Because obviously that's an imported word. But also it was their gender binaries and their kind of heteronormative kind of vision was quite heavy. So we worked through that and we worked with gay, trans community through that one. I'll talk about the participation thing after. And then another aspect that we worked on was young women working in maquila, sort of sweatshop type factories, which all feed the northern consumerism. And this was a textile factory. And that's something that's very common now in urban areas in Nicaragua. Is a lot of young people, either from rural areas or urban working class families, are ending up working in these factories that's based on piecework, and there's sort of no time limit. So a lot of them end up finishing like midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, in order to keep up with the quotas that they're supposed to be producing, and they use peer pressure on the lines to ensure that people do that. And what that means is in a place where there's quite a lot of sexual violence and gender violence and femicide and all sorts of things, means that they're particularly vulnerable once they leave work. If they leave in a group, they're okay, but then, if you're on your way home on the street, you're also quite vulnerable. But that was mostly about what the conditions of the factory were like. And then what was the fourth story? Pause. Was that because there were four? Oh yeah, and then the fourth story was how the family economy worked. And a lot of that had to do with the funders. They wanted to touch on the gender politics within the family economy. So this family was under pressure, and it was under economic pressure, which is why the girl ended up going into the maquila, because she was going to go study as a chef. That was her big dream, and then had to give it up because the father lost his job, and was unemployed, so then he got kind of quite depressed. So then that was interesting, because then we were looking at how that played into the gender roles and the gender violence as well, and how the gender violence is also repeated generation after generation. So in the backdrop of all this is the portrait of the father, right? So it's very much, it's very much kind of symbolized the whole sort of patriarchal order of it, and then mixed in with all the sort of neoliberal political and economic logic. So, yeah.
It was a project, like a soap opera project. You work on the narratives, but
yeah. It was a TV drama. That's what it was. And it was. And there was also, we dealt with in a couple of chapters. We dealt with the abortion issue too, because that was a really big issue that we felt that we couldn't, in all sort of ethical honesty, in the situation that Nicaragua was in right when we were writing it, not touch on that issue as a form of gender violence. So, because in the family, one of the figures in the family is a priest. So we use the figure of the priest and the kind of institutional consciousness, and then the faith and the kind of loyalty to people that this priest had, and brought him into contradiction around this issue of abortion.
Yeah, I come.
So that was fun.
Yeah.
Although it was censored when the TV series went to Dominican Republic, because the Dominican Republic partners didn't want to touch on the issue in Dominican Republic, which was quite, anyway, it's one of those things.
How long was the project?
Well, this was actually quite a long project, because there were only 20 episodes in terms of the product, but the process took a long time, and partly it took a long time because of the participatory research factor in it, which has to do with the whole kind of ethical risk of representation. So we, from the very beginning, we worked on sort of researching what the realities were. We kind of looked at, we knew enough about the reality of Nicaragua to have a sense of what those key topics could be, right, obviously. But then bringing those communities together and kind of creating a consultation group that then participated all the way through was sort of how we did it. So it took a long time, but then, any form of democracy, participation or whatever, it takes time, and it's important to take the time to get it right. Which also meant that it was it fed into their processes, and meant that they had something that they could then use in their organising and their work. Because the way it was set up is we did a process where we consulted with people, first of all, to understand the reality more. We went and visited people, we went to factories, and we went and we shared stuff with all the different communities. The trans community was really wonderful. We got a really good sense of that. We talked to women who've gone through themselves sexual abuse and now have organised and could tell us really quite intimate details about how that was structured in their lives and what that did. What else? We talked a lot and we went into factories as well. We managed to get into a sweatshop factory, which is a miracle. And it was really impressive, just seeing the way that the factory worked, and the numbers on the chart at the end, and the way the clothes piled up, and the way that how quickly it passed from one woman to the other, and you could see how the peer pressure would work on a line like that. And then also just the physical conditions. I came out of there coughing and bits in my nose and stuff like that. And a lot of people, you could see that they wouldn't wear the masks, or some people were wearing masks, but most people weren't wearing masks and things like that. So and then the dyes and all that, it's like, just look at that and think, and then the no labour, serious kind of labour unions allowed. So, that's really heavy work to be in there. And the noise, that was the other thing. The noise of all the machines, like white noise all day till midnight, can't imagine working in those conditions. It's very difficult. But it was very good, so we talked to women who worked in those conditions, and we also talked to a group of women who'd set up their own cooperative as an alternative, and that's what we used for the set. That was the location. We used their smaller factory, but then we had to kind of fake it so it looked bigger and etc. But that's what we used, and And that was really good too, because we could physically locate, because part of the issue is when you're writing these scripts, you actually do have to have a really good sense of the physical location of people and how, when you're writing a scene, like actually how the physical dynamics work when you're talking about, who's talking to who and where the supervisor comes in and what they're looking at and all that. So that was really good. And then what were the other communities that we talked to? Oh yeah, and then we had access to we worked with NGOs that were working specifically on sexual exploitation and trafficking, and this was about the sexual exploitation of adolescents, and so the trafficking. So it's all about adolescent girls, and we found out a huge amount, and it was actually quite scary. And we also did our own research about how young girls, especially, but also boys, get trapped into what conditions make them vulnerable. For example, things like displacement, or not really having a community, or not really having effective environments and things like that. Affective, right? And then how people approach them and like capture them through friendship or through appreciation, and then gradually draw them into like sexualization and then the sexual exploitation of them, and then they're at risk for trafficking. So that chain, we had to be very careful that we did that right, because what we were doing too was sometimes at the end of each chapter we would sort of focus in on one particular thing, and then that one we would say like, it was a kind of warning message saying, if you have been in this situation or you've seen someone who's in this situation, there's, please talk to them or whatever. And then there was a crisis line. So we used crisis line stuff as well and things like that. We were using local resources, and with the sexual exploitation and trafficking thing, we also had access all the way up to the top of the police force. So, because these NGOs were coordinating with a police force that was specialised in this stuff, and that was coordinating with the head of equivalent of the Home Office. So that was kind of strange, going into those circles. But it was quite interesting because they also had things that they knew from their practices, especially the police, that were really like there were things that we were imagining, thinking, well, yeah, maybe we're just imagining it, and then you kind of hear the story the same or worse, kind of thing. And there was a lot of issues about the borders, right? Like what happens because a lot of this is like, oh, I'll take you somewhere else, right? And there's like all the romance of going to another country, and then as soon as they get them out of the border, that's it. So a lot of what the police were talking about too was Central American coordination on that. So because a lot of girls get trafficked up to, through a lot of the center of the networks right now that are operating in Nicaragua operate out of Guatemala. But of course, all of these are connected into political circles and other sort of top circles. So you are touching on issues that touch on some pretty heavy people, because they're all connected into mafia, narco trafficking, all of this stuff. So actually, during the process, I actually had a specific experience around this, and I tried to use these networks, and I got shut down by a couple of people. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and dangerous. Yeah. Interesting. And
yeah, it's really big.
Yeah.
Scary.
Who was the people? Okay. What were the main outcomes you already talked about?
No, not that much, because okay. I should explain that too. That as well as going through this process, we started by doing this research. Then we started writing up the storylines, and then we went back and said, okay, what do you think of these storylines, right? So then we got input on the storylines, obviously other input, creative input, and all sorts of stuff. But from these particular groups about, is this actually believable, and how real is this, and does this, do you think this reflects the kind of problems that you've been telling us about? So then we went up to a next stage where we were writing the scripts, and we would get the scripts up to about, second or third draft, and then we would take that draft and we would start to look at dialogue, and it was really good, because they gave us dialogue sometimes. I mean, even it was just really nice, and also they would say, nah, they wouldn't say that. So it was really good, because it really kind of, as a writer, it really grounds you. And then the next stage was, sort of looking at I think we also did a pilot validation with the potential audience, which was different, a different group of people, which was very interesting, and also got feedback on that. And then in the end, once the whole thing rolled out, because we actually did several consultations, even on the scripts with some groups, and then once the whole thing was rolled out and it had been filmed and in production, some of which was also consulted because of the issues of the locations and the reality of the places, then in the end, these thematic threads were as well as watching the TV program as it is, they were taken out as threads, and then I also worked a little bit on these methodological packages that were constructed, and those are particularly focused on the issues. So it takes the overarching story across the series just in that theme, and then there's a package that goes into training sessions and things, and then at the very end also there's a kind of consultation process with school kids, because a lot of it, I suppose, it was more of a general audience this time, but I mean the focus of it was definitely on probably teenagers, young people. Yeah. So.
And what did you do with the methodological, how did that workshops went?
Well, because in Nicaragua there's a fairly well-organized feminist movement that's doing a lot of community work and a lot of work with young women. And there's also young women's networks, and then there's also connections through other NGOs who are working on youth issues or who are working on some of these specific issues, like the trafficking issue, or there's also a group called the MEC, which is a women's organisation which works with maquila workers. So all of these things were sort of plugged into organisations that can use them in their training, and I call it training, but like self-reflection processes and empowerment processes that they're working on. So that's what that's used for. I mean, training is capacitación, so it's and it's used as this catchword, but actually it's quite a horrible development word that we don't really like. But yeah, that's what it was used. So what that meant was it was also the whole program served as an instrument for working on these issues and getting people to reflect about and think about them and put it through themselves and their own lives and think about how that works.
What do you think were the effects of that project in Nicaragua?
Oof, that's quite difficult because in the end it wasn't aired until after I left. But if the last program's anything to go by, it's very interesting. You can have a sense of the direct effects because you can see what happens when you come in you're in the face-to-face encounters or the material's actually used. But then, because it's in mass media, which is very expensive and it's a little bit crazy in a certain way in a country as poor as Nicaragua to do something like this, but there's an effect through the mass media that is quite surprising in a way when you've worked on it, because you can sit on a bus and you're chatting to someone, they say, what are you doing? And you say, well, I'm working this place in Managua, I'm doing some writing. Oh yeah, right, what are you writing? And so I say, well, whatever, working on such and such a thing. And they said, oh yeah, well, thinking of the one previously, they'd say, oh yeah, I saw that, and I thought this, and I said, and they start talking about the characters in the same way that you feel familiar with them. Do you know what I mean? So there's a kind of intimacy about it. You kind of get into this sort of intimate world through that. And because people in Nicaragua, in a place like Nicaragua, there's a real soap opera culture. So it's like Mexican soap operas, Venezuelan soap operas, especially Brazilian soap operas, which everybody loves. And everybody, you can sit on a street corner with your neighbours and they'll be chatting about the soap opera and they'll be analysing the soap opera. So there's it's a very oral culture, but there's a very, what would you call that, a kind of TV intelligent or video intelligent audience that analyse the characters. When we put the pilot, in front of this focus group, our executive producer was all worried about whether or not they're going to get it, and they got everything. They even got the father's portrait. We only had it there for just like a brief moment, but it's this kind of dark portrait. You can kind of tell it's this kind of shadowy guy who's got this rather grim look on his face, and people captured that really quickly and said, well, something's going on here, they got it. So I think that it's a very well-versed audience So that's really a pleasure, because you know that the things that you're sewing in there, the more subtle stuff, is really working. On the other hand, I think critically, I think in the end, there were some things that we did that we didn't do very well. Like, I think there were some moments in it which, because you're dealing with very painful, extreme situations, there were some moments that just verged on melodrama as well. And also, I disagreed with some decisions about what was put right on camera. I thought some of the more sort of sexual exploitation stuff should have been even more veiled, and just, there could have been a bit more care taken over that, I felt, because it was right in your face, which I understand. On the one hand, you want to put some of this stuff in your face, but there was some stuff that I felt was kind of like violent, watching it in a way that I don't like, that I wasn't quite in agreement with. But anyway, I mean, you're working with a team, and there's only so much you can do as a writer as well once it goes into production. And the executive producer and the director were basically deciding about a lot of that stuff. Although we did discuss that a lot when we were writing. Like, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to put this figure of this young girl in front of this older guy who's buying her? Like, how are we going to actually do that in a way that's not going to be violatory as well? And it was very difficult. The process for the actress in that particular storyline was really challenging and really difficult. And also, obviously, you take on a character like that in someone like Nicaragua, well, I think anywhere, an actress taking on that role is going to then deal with a lot of stigma, because she's, people are seeing her as the character. And that happened in the previous one as well, but it was really difficult with this one. So, I mean, she had to work through a hell of a lot of stuff for herself. Amazing young woman. So, hats off to her. I mean, the actors in general. I mean, the issue of acting too is acting's still quite young in Nicaragua in terms of TV acting and things like that. So, if you watch the series, you'll kind of go in some bits, but they really just put their lives and souls into it. Yeah, and also the actors afterwards, in the process of talking to audiences and young people. Of course, the crew, the cast, is what does a lot of that. So they're also involved in the politics of it and the participatory education of it and all of that. They're involved in that. So they're the ones that go, and of course that's kind of great, because like by then they're kind of locally well-known figures. So the kids like that as well.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, why do you think it's important to do this type of projects? Like, to do them like that, to go over all that process to build that type of results.
To do all of the participatory process.
Yeah, why should you do it in that way instead of just, don't go into people, don't consult them?
Well, I think there's loads of reasons why. First of all, you're building into a social movement and social change. You're not just doing TV to do TV, and the content of it is totally different from, like, if you look at some of the Mexican and Venezuelan telenovelas, and also some of the Brazilian ones. A lot of them about rich people, and all of their kind of like petty fights and like really just sick, and they reproduce like really nasty. I wouldn't even call them values, but like so the topic's different, but also the way that you build in the ethics of it into the building of social movement and social change means that the issues of representation, you're dealing with them and you're reflecting about them as part of your process, and at the same time you're giving space to people to represent themselves, even though in the end you're kind of channeling it through the media and through your writing. You're hearing natural voices and you're able to actually use people's own words. So you've got a script, or you've got a TV drama that is recognizable. People can recognize themselves in it in a way that I don't think perhaps the other things are often fantasy kind of world things. You know what I mean? They're very much based on the writer's fantasies often. Whereas in this, as a writer, you obviously engage in your imagination, because we took all of these stories in and we created a fictional space for them. But I think it helped us ground ourselves in our own ethic, that we're talking about real people and real lives, and and people deserve to be talked about on their own terms and in their own words. And the fact that people gave so generously of their own words, they knew what we were doing. We were made an alliance around that. So the program was part of them. They felt part of it, but it was also part of them. And then also then became something that they could use in their work to extend their work. So, and something really attractive, like a TV program. That's what, especially young people really love that kind of stuff. So I think that's a big reason.
What are the key learnings? What worked, what didn't?
Yeah, well, I mentioned one of those already, which is the issue of, it's very difficult really in a way to, when you get to the kind of crisis moments in the stories, it's really difficult to know. Well, actually right now I'm studying some of this stuff, but it has to do with when you're dealing with traumatic pain or any forms of trauma or extreme violence or torture or any of those things, there's a certain level of it that is unspeakable. The language, it destroys language. The language falls away. You end up, so it's very, very difficult to write that. And I think, this is my issue, is that TV compared to film is much more dialogue based, and that's one of the things that drives me a bit nutty about working for TV. I'd much rather write for film if I was going to write, because those kinds of moments I would have liked for us to have been able to take the dialogue away much more, because the dialogue it's also what makes it a bit melodramatic. There's a silence and there's a power of the image for those kinds of moments. You don't need to say anything else. So I think some of that, but then, those would be disagreements probably with my executive producer. She liked a lot of talking, and she liked to describe and kind of explain a lot more than me. So I think, that's quite difficult. It's difficult also to work on a team of writers rather than writing your own individual thing, that's because there's constant negotiation about the stories. On the one hand, you've got lots of different ideas, because one head, only thinks of a certain range of things, and so it's really fruitful at the beginning, but then it's a tussle, trying to figure out how you... So that was one part, and then the other is the issue of how do you represent violence, on a mass media. I think visually as well, it's, especially from a feminist point of view, because there's, basically most of us involved in this have some form of feminist ethics. I think those kinds of issues are really difficult, and I'm not sure we got it right all the time. And there's this one particular moment that I definitely think we didn't get right. Yeah, because it went too over the top and it was too talky, and so between those two things and then the exposure of the actress, I think it was too much, personally. But on the other hand, things that really did work were, in the first series that I worked on, we were trapped in a set. We had a set for this one, but it was much better built, and it was like the inside of an old house, and it was a family setting, and it was much more believable. So we all worked on kind of thinking out the set, which was nice. But then we also got to escape from the set, because the program was set in a very beautiful location, which is called Granada, which is this colonial city. And that was part of it. It's a big tourist city. So part of what we were doing is we were taking this fabulous, beautiful, exotic location, and then we're saying, have a look at the underbelly of this. And some of that was to do with sexual tourism, obviously, because the sexual exploitation had to do with the reason it was happening in that city is because there's a lot of tourism. So the underbelly was, okay, there's the sexual tourism going on and how the hotels are all connected into that. And then another underbelly is what's happening in the economy and, what the sweatshop factory kind of situations and things like that. And then the kind of spaces for freedom, it's where, we had, the love story was absolutely fabulous, because we had a transgender character who is a young person who was in transition in high school, and who, it was kind of a binary transition. And then there was a young guy who in Nicaragua would be considered effeminate, who is gay. So the two of these get together. So one of the people on the writing group team was a bit, well, let's say she didn't have the most open sexual politics. Couldn't get her head around this. So what is this? And then, I mean, I had such pleasure with other people. Like, we were just so enjoying the fact that we created a love story that it didn't matter, and there was no way you could actually name it, right? So we just had such fun with that, and it was lovely. I remember writing some of those things that were really just very beautiful and lovely. So that gave some relief to all of this other stuff as well, and that became a space of freedom. So that's kind of nice, because you're setting up the space of freedom in a non-normative, way, and then all of the kind of consequences of all of the sort of power relations and all of the inequalities are contrasted with this kind of space of freedom that's kind of grabbed and stolen away from that. So I think that definitely worked. So, and I think these beautiful visuals really worked, because the contrast between these beautiful visuals and the, like, really heavy, just violent stories, which are real, totally real, that contrast, I think, works quite well. I think lots of writers do that as well. I mean, if you look around and look at the kinds of novels that are winning prizes, for example, they're playing around with that, and then, especially in like post-colonial literature, like taking this kind of exotic kind of conception and then like turning that around. I love that. I think it's a very political act, and I think it needs to be done, and I enjoy doing it. So.
Right. Do you think there was any problem related to funding? Does the funding affected in any sort of way decisions?
Oh my God, yeah. That's the worst thing about it. I think the worst thing about doing television is it's too expensive. And especially in a place like Nicaragua, we had to actually build the studio. We didn't just build the set, we built the studio. So we had to build the studio and the set, and then the kind of even stuff like this, like just really basic things that you need to have to be able to do something on this scale of ambition. Means that you have to actually create the infrastructure, and it also means that your project also becomes a school in a way for actors and filmmakers, and so people that worked on the series are now gone on and doing other films. It's great to see, because I'm on Facebook and I see all these things that they're doing, and I'm going, yeah, but the thing about the funding is you have to get a large amount of funding. So the executive producer worked a lot on that, and she's very good at that, and she's kind of mover and shaker and knows how to do it. But you do kind of feel sometimes a bit like, because in the funding, as far as I'm aware, they created this kind of, what do you call that, consortium of funders. But they were big funders, like, so, we're doing this program, this is one of the contradictions of it is, we're doing this program, and the funding's coming, Gates Foundation, I think even Nike may have had something to do in that, yeah, which is a bit contradictory, isn't it, with doing something about maquilas. Unfortunately, obviously I'm not very diplomatic, I wouldn't get put into the role of fundraising for something like this, probably, because I can't deal with some of that world. But anyway, so that was one issue which I think was quite difficult, which is like, are we like allowing somebody to sort of wash their hands of this by saying that they supported this program? So that's one thing. But then on the other hand, the other thing that I think was quite complicated, there was sort of two things. The one of the funders really kind of was allowed by the executive producer to have quite a level of hands-on in it. And I think there's a difference between people who are involved and affected by situations like this and actually allowing the funders to, start sticking their fingers in the scripts, which happened with the economic, with the gender relations in the family economy. That happened, and which meant that partner organisations for this fund, which was funding us, funding some people in Dominican Republic, and I can't remember where else. They were kind of starting to put their fingers in the pie, and I found that very difficult as a writer. And the other thing I think was quite difficult about the funding was this issue of the abortion story, which was just as relevant in Dominican Republic at that moment as it was in Nicaragua. The fact that a partner organization was allowed to, cut out a section of the TV series seemed to me a bit much. And that had to do with, and the executive producer was kind of explaining that had to do with the relationships that were set up in the funding and da. And okay, well, whatever. Something that I wouldn't have ceded personally, but it happened. And then, so those kinds of issues I think are quite key. So if I was going to do, probably wouldn't do a project that ambitious or that big or with that many themes. But I mean, if I was going to sort of do something maybe smaller scale, if I was getting funding for it, I would make sure that there's a kind of clear line between funding, which is one thing, you are going to support the project that we are going to do, but the decisions about this, about the money, okay, well, we'll negotiate that with you, but the decisions about the content and what goes into it and then the details of it, we're not going to consult with the funders, we're going to consult with the people who are affected. And that's a political issue, for me. You don't, these are processes that you hope will create space for people to empower themselves, and the people who've got that kind of power over with money, they've got enough power. So if you're going to make space for people's intervention in your scripts, let's do it with people that we care about and need space and recognition. That's what I think.
Okay, could you just list what rules should be taken into account for this type of project, like the top rules, like consult people, what we're trying to, that's Sophie's job, is to identify what's the critiques that this type of doing participatory projects has received, what's people criticizing about this approach.
Well, I mean, if you can take a participatory approach, but you can actually use people, right? So I think one of the big things is you have to be kind of very aware of also what you're doing, and create an environment where you are giving people space to also, question you and kick back. But I think a lot of it has to do with trust too. It's like people trust you if they know that you're genuinely listening to them, that you're taking on board the things that they're saying, and that you're trying to, sincerely reflect and incorporate and recognize what they're saying. So when there's a sense that people feel that they have been recognized, then there's an amazing sense of trust, and not just trust, but like joy and laughter, and like some of these sessions, especially with really irreverent trans people that we were there. I mean, they were so funny. We just did and we just had fun as well, right? So, but I think a lot of it has to do with not kind of putting yourself above people. It's just like sitting side by side with people and saying, look, okay, I'm doing this, you guys have done this, I have this knowledge, you have this knowledge, let's share and circulate that, and let's see what happens when those two things, or three things, or whatever, many things come together out of different experiences and different kinds of ways of theorizing our lives, really. So I think that kind of horizontality, understanding that, and checking yourself, like looking yourself in the mirror and saying, am I actually using, okay, I'm using somebody's words, but what does that mean? Am I actually kind of instrumentalizing it? And are people getting recognition at the end of this process, for what they've been involved in? I mean, that was the funniest thing at the end of the TV show. There's credits went on. They were the longest credits, because obviously we wanted to put some key people in there who'd been in those processes. We couldn't put everybody, but we put a lot of people who were in those processes. We put their credits up there because they contributed, they were part of it. So that's another issue, make sure they're in the credits. Credits are always a big issue, I think, because credit is a kind of formal recognition that you need to do. And then, I don't know, there's loads and loads of things. I think who your writers are is quite important, and how sensitive they are. Like, I've had two experiences now with doing this TV program. On the one hand, this previous series and this one, and on the one hand, I think it's good that you get people in who have diverse kind of approaches, and that we're not all you know, you've got to avoid doing a kind of politically correct TV show. One of the best things that we were told by the person that came and did training in TV teaching to us was, he always said, take the taboo, just push the taboo, you know, like address the taboo, don't be afraid to address taboos. Taboos where the stories are, and then take your characters and push them right up to the edge and then just pull them back at the last minute. So those kinds of things are good, like it's all about risk taking. And I think politically correct series, I mean, so there were moments in the script where I did feel that there was some intervention sort of in terms of the institutional kind of desires for like modelling things and, you know, things like that. I was kind of going, don't know if I like that very much. You do want to kind of show alternatives, but you have to be very careful, I think, not to create these kind of plastic models at the end of it. This is the politically correct way to deal with, you know, your daughter, you know, or something like that. Which you kind of want to encourage people to think about what they're doing in their mother-daughter relationships or whatever it is, but you don't really want to create this kind of middle-class, nice, politically correct version of what you're supposed to be doing, you know what I mean? So I think that's an issue as well. Like your political desire, you have to kind of bury it a bit under your risk, and that risk means challenge yourself, right? So like I can remember when I did a story in the first series, I decided that I wanted to work on a story with a street kid coming into somebody's house. Yeah, because I was thinking, okay, what would I do if street kid came into my house, right? I would be like probably you know, quite romantic and very nice and da 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 da. And then, okay, so what would you do if you had a knife and maybe you was sniffing glue, or you know what I mean? Like, okay, I'm touching stuff that I'm not sure, you know. Okay, I could say in theory how I do with that, but actually put yourself in the situation and make sure that character's real, and just like smash those two things together and see what happens. So those are the kinds of risks that I'm saying that, and so you do have to touch all of your own stuff really in depth and really dare to do that. So that part of the self-reflection I think is really important. You just got to look at yourself a bit and kind of say, and then pushing yourself. Yeah. So I don't know if there's anything else I should say about that. I can't think of the funders. I've already said something about. Make sure, because I was talking about make sure the writing team is diverse, but try to ensure that there's at least a kind of minimal previous process, especially with the writers, but everybody involved really in the creative process, to go through some of these issues and to kind of, I think you need to do a selection process where you spot people that have got ingrained prejudices and probably need to root them out. That's what I would think. Just because that then becomes a major obstacle and you're not working with, you need to be kind of, to a certain extent, even if you have a diverse group of people, you need to have a certain level of being in tune with each other. In sintonia, I was thinking, being in tune with each other, yeah. Because then you can create from there. But if you're having to like deal with deep-rooted prejudices, your basic lowest common denominator is kind of a lot further down than where you really want to be in a series like this. So it's quite difficult. You're kind of battling a bit with that sometimes. So that's another thing. And yeah, and also it means that the creative decisions, you need to have people fairly aware of how their creative decisions are playing into or not playing into or counteracting the kind of established status quo mythology and stereotypes and everything else. Yeah. So the process beforehand, I think, is really important. Like just preparing people and getting them to think about themselves and their lives, and and where their pain is like coming out in like not very positive ways. So a lot of it, I think, is just very, very working on yourself, and then working with other people, creating spaces for encounter with other people that aren't appropriation spaces, or and that are dealing with those ethics, I guess.
Cool.
So in the first series that we did, one of the things that we did, we tried to ensure that on the writers' team there were people who were also involved directly in these issues. It's not always possible, because sometimes the person isn't there, right? But when we were kind of in training processes, that gave you an opportunity. So when we were in writers training, it gives you the opportunity to bring people in from different communities. They can train as a writer, so they're writing also. So they're also the writers. So that's the part of it, is the participation, is that you're not just creating a professional team that's completely divorced from the communities, but you actually got a team that's professionalizing themselves in writing for TV or whatever it is, or filmmaking or editing or whatever it is, but that is coming from some of these communities as well, so that people are making their own, and that strengthens. That's the thing, is people themselves making their own media, making their own story, telling their own stories as well. So I mean, I really believe that, because I worked a lot in radio with that as well, where people were trained in radio and then came in and were doing their own radio. So it's like breaking down those boundaries between the professional, which is what gives you status and power, of course, and just, ordinary lives. I mean, in the end, we all live ordinary lives, so why do we have to feel that, we've had access to learning stuff, so why should we feel that we're any better or any worse than anyone else, right? And so how then do you, connect that up and actually give other people space and opportunities as well that you've had, maybe because you're in a more privileged position. So I think that's important as well, and that's an ethical thing. And that's probably a more long-term thing that comes out of projects like this. It's like, how do you actually start creating a kind of body of people who are not actually your typical elite, professionals, but actually people making media.